Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, my name is Yvonne Liser. I am a member of Colonel John Washington Capital Montgomery chapter, DAR. And just a half an hour ago, I was the regent of that chapter. I just turned it. I'm also the new state registrar for DAR. And outside of DAR, genealogy is kind of a habit. So, I am the elected historian for the Kent Clifford families of West Virginia's family reunion, which has been going on since 1973. I am also their genealogist and their DNA project administrator. For the Francis family of Virginia, I am their genealogist, their family historian of their reunions, and also their DNA project administrator. For the charity family of Virginia, I am one of the many people who is updating the family lineage book. It's a 900-page book of African American family. We have them traced to the 1600s from when they came as indentured servants from England to Virginia, all the way up to the present. So the 900-page book was written many years ago, so now we have to fix some errors and add in the lineage. And outside of the African American families, as a result of one of the other West Virginia family DNA projects, we found out that we're direct descendants of the Optenroth family, founders of Germantown, Pennsylvania. And now I'm working on a project with them to figure out, because their name changed, like we're going to talk about name changes, but they were Optenroths when they came here, but now they're up to Groves, up to Graffs, and Stevens for some reason. So I'm also working with them and also figuring out there were Quaker family that somehow wound up in the War of 1812 and in my little town of West Virginia. So those are just a few things I do. And outside of that, I have a full-time job. So let's get started. I do want to explain, this is more of a tips and tricks. It's an intermediate class. So we're going to give general tips. Not to say these will work for everyone. One thing about genealogy, I say I'm not an expert, because who is? I mean, things change constantly. It's different from person to person, family to family, area to area. But I will there are handouts here you can pick up. They're just resources and other general information on emancipation, state census records, and things like that you find helpful in your research. And I'll give you as many tips and tricks as possible, so then we'll have questions and answers after. So let's get started. And just any time you're doing genealogy, it's always great to start with yourself and work backwards, because you know yourself better than anyone else in your family tree. So work with start with yourself, move it backwards, and write everything that you know first. So you start with yourself, write down you know your parents' name, where they're born, you go through that, and write down everything that you know, and then you come back and you start researching. I always recommend using more than one supporting document for proof. We have what we call primary sources and secondary. Primary is something that happened at the time of the event. We prefer that. It doesn't guarantee it's right. I have a 94-year-old cousin who's still trying to prove that he's not a female, because his birth certificate is listed as a female, and the hospital is burnt down, and everyone he knows that knew that he was born is gone, and the state of West Virginia is like, you're still a woman. So, I don't know. But it doesn't mean that's always correct. But secondary information is something like on a death certificate, you'll see the listing for the birthplace, or the name of the parents, things like that. You're depending on someone else's memory or what their knowledge of a situation, so that may not always be excellent information. So we recommend that you get more than one supporting document for proof. We're going to talk a little bit more about family folklore. I think everyone has heard family stories. There's always a story about great-great-grandma, someone doing something, and great-great-grandpa was an Indian chief. It's important that you write down your family folklore, and we'll talk about it in a second. Research the history of your family's location. Sometimes your family never left their house, but they were in a different town, county, and state. So get to know, do research about the area that you're researching. because the laws change and the property and the records change, so it's very important. Don't make the internet your only source of proof. And I'm going to start this off by, I do like Ancestry.com. I like them all. But the family trees out there have possibly some of the worst information. It's not backed up by anything, or they're just linked to someone else. It's great to use as a clue. Personally, I don't look at other people's family trees because I tend to be led by it a little bit, so I'll say, oh, maybe this is. Once you've been researching for 3 days for one piece of information, well, maybe this is the right one. I recommend just kind of staying clear, unless you can find, they have documents. If you can see on their family tree, they have an actual document attached to it saying it. I would recommend just working through it on your own. Also, the internet has gotten fantastic. You can find records. The state of West Virginia, I just love because they put every vital record up, even some that probably should not be there. I just found like a wedding from the 70s, like, that's not supposed to be there. But they put also, I can sit at home and I can go through and just research my family, because almost my entire line of my family is just from West Virginia. So it's great. However, you lose a lot. Because there are county records, there are courthouse records, county libraries, state archives, NSDARs, libraries here. There are so many records that aren't available online. And sometimes you find hidden gems. There was just a DAR member who posted on Facebook the other day. Almost everything was burnt in a county in Ohio. I can't remember what county it is. And she was going through some book she found in this courthouse, and it said Sheriff's Records. And it had pages and pages of marriages, Who knew why? And it's never been recorded anywhere. No one really knew it was there. So now she knows. She's the only person that found this, and she took pictures, put it on Facebook. But that's something that you just found. I found in the Library of Virginia, which is a fantastic library, because they have information from West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina. And they have possibly one of the best resources there, but I did find something that was put in the middle of a microfilm. It was, we'll talk about a registry of free Negroes, that like a page of it was used as like a ledger on a doctor's, I don't know, like a doctor's book, because that's one of the unique resources you can use. Doctor's books sometimes list names of families and things like that. So, for some reason, someone's freedom paper was being used to line up the thing on the ledger for a document, and it was just there on the microfilm network. So it was fantastic. So, those little things you can find when you go to actual places. Be prepared when you're doing African American genealogy. You may have to do the family trees of several families outside your own, and we'll talk about it, but don't shy away from that. You can learn a lot. You can really advance your genealogy by being willing to do other family trees. And it's always great to network with other family researchers. There are tons of them out there. There's some of the resources I listed. And of course, there are Facebook groups now. LinkedIn has wonderful groups. So I always feel it's always good to work with other family researchers. Family folklore. So, one of the most common in African American, and I'm actually finding in European American genealogy as well, is the Native American heritage. I've heard so often that it's always the great-great-grandparent is Blackfoot, Cherokee. There are a lot of different things. And then someone recently asked me, my grandfather was half Cherokee, and his mother was full Cherokee or something. And he said, we did a DNA test, and it came out we only had 1% DNA. Yeah, that means that they learned. but that has, and just in that particular person, who is an African American, but that particular person, we went through her genealogy, and for generations, her family has been applying for Native American citizenship, and every time they rejected, it was just one after another after another. And it's like, well, how many? We don't know how much you made, but we were always told, and this is what they write. We were always told that my great-great-grandfather was, or my great-great-grandmother was. So it is a common one. I don't like to throw Railway Family Local Folklore, I did that. And then I took a DNA test, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we're telling the truth. Somewhat. So, there is sometimes a vein of, that story started somewhere. So it's good to talk to various people in your family and have them tell you that story, family folklore. Then sit down and you compare all those stories, see the common threads, the things that's emphasized most, and hold on to those while you research. Because family folklore really can, my grandfather had always said, my grandfather was not American, and he had claimed his mother was from Egypt, and his father was from Martinique, but he was French, and he died in a polo accident. And he gave their names and all kinds of, I have all this information. And there's no way his mother was from Egypt. But no. But then I took a DNA test, and guess what? I do have that in my DNA. So I know it wasn't my grandmother. My great-grandmother was somewhere down the road. So there's a story out there that might be correct. It might just be further back. And if you do have clues and hints, like I said, it's always good to just keep it on the side. One thing that I do, this picture is hand notes someone had taken from a 97-year-old family member in 1942. She took these notes, and they're interesting because we don't understand what half of them even mean. But some of it, some of them are folklore. Let's put it that way. The one thing about family folklore is always be prepared when you share with your family the reaction. You don't always get the best reaction when you tell them that the story that's been going on for generations isn't true. So it's good basic facts. So I think the best way to approach African American genealogy is breaking it down by eras of documentation and how you do the research. So starting with 1950 to the present, these handsome young men, they're at Howard University at the time. There is no census available because census records are not made public for 75 years, so from the time of the census. So the most common one, the most recent we have is 1940. So there's no census records available, and we use that a lot in research. This is the time you can gather vital records. Of course, if you're in a closed state, like DC. You can have an issue getting some vital records from people you're not the immediate descendant of. So if it's not your basic, it's not your parent or grandparent, I think in Maryland, you have that issue as well. I am a huge fan of newspapers. And when I first started doing genealogy research, I never really checked newspapers. So I figured, how many black people are going to show up in a newspaper? Well, it just so happens that, they do show up quite a bit. Because when they do something even a little bad or something even a little good, it becomes newsworthy, especially in small towns. So you check your local newspapers, not just local newspapers, check newspapers to if it's a rural area, cities, larger cities next to it, because they sometimes carry those as well. The Social Security Death Index is free on most websites. Especially in Ancestry. But it won't give you everything. It'll give you, I think, the month and year of death. It'll give you the date of birth, the person's name, when they, where they lived. I think that's the one. Where they lived when they received their last benefit. People look at the Social Security Death Index and take for granted, and now that's their place of death. That's not their place of death. That's the place where they received their last benefit. So, if nothing else, that's just where their last check was mailed. Find a Grave website is really good. You can search them for your ancestor all across the country. If even if you don't know the state, and you can sometimes get photographs. The photographs aren't already on the website. You can request it, and every single time I requested someone to take a photo for me at Find a Grave, every single time we have. Sometimes within a week, so it's great. Also, cemetery records are really good. If you go to a cemetery, if you know where your ancestor is buried, do not feel bad about going and asking the cemetery, can I have a copy of the record? There's wonderful information on the records, and they are happy to give it to you. So that's another way to get information. Court records and school records and yearbooks. I was cleaning, we just sold my grandmother's house after many years down on the bay in Annapolis. And in her attic, I found all of her yearbooks from high school. And it was interesting what Grandma wanted to be when she grew up. And I mean, so I got more of a story about my grandmother. You know, it's not just one of the documents. I love gathering the stories about people. Okay, so let's talk about researching from 1900 to 1949. I love this researching during this decade because I have so much information. This is where the Great Migration was evident. So the Great Migration was about 6 million African Americans moved from the rural South to the Northeast, Midwest, and the West. I think it was the first migration was 1910 to 1930, and that was mainly rural to Midwestern and Northwestern cities, and that was for industrial purposes. So they got jobs. So you saw a lot going into Chicago, you saw a lot going into Detroit during that time. And the second Great Migration, I think it was from 1940. 1940 to 1970, and that's when African Americans actually became urban women. And then we're actually in the current migration, what they call it the New Migration, that started in 1965, and that's actually going the opposite direction. A lot of African Americans are moving south because of families, cost of living, job opportunities, and things like that. The 1900 census is also important because this is the very first federal census that Native Americans were enumerated. So if you do have Native American ancestry, that's going to be the first time you find them on a census. It's the 1900. Also the other thing is that this is where you start seeing inconsistency for the pattern of the place and birth and death for people. So the reason why for African Americans the 1900 census was such a big deal, you're talking about maybe the first generation or second generation out of slavery. So these are the first groups of people that may have known when they were born or where they were born. They may not know that much about where their parents were born, but take a look. When you go through the censuses from 1900 to 1940, take a look to see what the consistency is, the years of birth, the place of birth, and the place of birth for their parents. And sometimes you'll see, like, you might find that it's different in every single census, but try to find a pattern to get a better idea on where to search next. The widow or widower possibilities is one of my favorite, and it drove me crazy. Actually, this happened for 5 years on my father's family. The great-grandmother had listed, great-great-grandmother, had listed herself as a widow, and I looked for years for this man's death certificate. And it happened here in the city. He died. I went all over trying to find it. And then I found out what widow or widower does mean. It doesn't mean necessarily that they died, maybe they divorced. It's just not popular to say widow. And I found this several times because after that incident, I was looking for 5 years. And I found it, I kept finding him. I said, well, this can't possibly be him. This guy's written up in the newspaper. It can't be him. He died in like between 1900 and 1910. No, he divorced her. He sued her for divorce. And I found it in several other situations. So if you are researching a person, and the man or the woman, these men did it too, are listed as widows, and you can't find the death date of the spouse, just take a look to see if they're still around. If they're not, it's possible that maybe their death just wasn't recorded or anything else would have happened. But take a look around, because there is a possibility that person did not actually die. And this decade is also great for the vital records, because by 1905, almost every state required birth, death, and marriages to be recorded. Not everyone. I think Alabama may have been 1910 for a few things. But it's very important for you to check. You can Google it and take a look to see when registrations are required for your state. And it usually is different for death, marriage, and birth. Because anything before that, you might get some county records or church records. For African Americans, you don't see the church records as much. So it's a good idea to take a look. And also, this is a great time, it sounds horrible, but it's a great time for burial there. I mean, These are actually registered deaths, and these were cemeteries that weren't necessarily the small family plot, or like my family who keeps talking about this family cemetery or the town cemetery, and I go, and there's no headstones there. And the reason why is because people just don't die, just go up there and bury them. So unfortunately, with those type of burials, which you saw fewer of after 1900, a lot of times they just marked it with a piece of wood, or you just had the guy in town who kind of knew where everyone was buried. So 1900 is also a good time to be able to start looking for death records, cemeteries, and burials. 1870 to 1899. So the 1870 census is the first census that all African Americans were listed. So it can vary, just to run back really quick. You know, people say that doing African American genealogy is so different. Pretty much between 1870 and the present, it's the same no matter who you are researching, unless you're Native American. Then it's 1900. So from 1870 on, African Americans were first listed in the census, all. Now, an alert for the 1870 census. You will find, like I said, this is the first census after emancipation. So you're going to find large households or communities with people with the same surname. Do not take for granted that they're related, biologically or even anything more than they just happen to be living near each other. The 1870 census is a great place to start researching, but you really have to do a lot of digging from there. And the 1880 census is, you can see surname changes. Given that surname changes are actually quite frequent over the 1870 and 1880 census, because we're going to talk about names in a little bit. But you can imagine that when you did not have a surname, and you had a chance to get one, and you got it, and you're like, that's really not working out for me. So you change it, or your given name. Well, you know what, I really don't like that either. So you can see sometimes surname changes actually more than once, back and forth. We'll be talking about name changes in a little bit. Like I said, pay careful attention to the community and surrounding families in 1870. There's a good chance that if they were owned by slaves, it is possible at that point they are living by their slave owners. So 1870 census is really good for that. We get excited, like I said, about the 1870 census because you're like, yes, I finally see the family. The one thing is that you're going to have, there are probably a lot of unknown children for emancipated slaves, because you're only going to see the people in the household, the children that are living there now. It's possible there were children that were married, passed away, moved on. So you really don't know. There are a few things you can do. There's not much. One of the things I do is sit in the middle of the night is, let's go through a county book to list all marriages and see everyone has the same parents as them. You can do it online as well. You can do it. I like Family Search best for that, because if you type in the parent's name, it'll go through and give you. It's pretty consistent. I give you that information. But if you do have county books that list marriages and births and death records, the same thing. And they'll tell you who the common parents are. But a lot of times you'll also find sometimes the daughters come back home with the parents. So you might find them in the later ones. A lot of times they come back with the child. And later on, as the parents age, you'll see the parents in the homes of one of their children. So you may not, and that's usually one of the younger children, but there may be a child you never knew about, and you can find them later census. If you have an unfound ancestor on the census of this era, from 1870, because there are a lot of people, and I've complained to, I cannot find my ancestor in 1870. There is a possibility with transcription errors, people taking census records who not necessarily the most educated people, some of the people that were giving the information to the census taker were that they weren't able to spell their own names. A lot of things are going to be phonetic. And like I said, there were name changes as well. So there is a possibility that your ancestor wasn't skipped, because sometimes people are skipped. Sometimes entire communities are skipped. Sometimes people aren't skipped, it's just that it's so far off of what their name should have been, you have a hard time finding it. Like I said, if there's a name change. Skilled labor. That's a good one. So in 1870, they list what the job is. And for people who have been slaves, if you see a head of household that has a job that's something like a cooper, who's a person who makes barrels, or a shoemaker, or something like that, that is skilled labor. So that person had an apprenticeship of some sort to learn that. That may really help you a lot in searching for a slave ancestor, because not too many slaves had a lot of skill. So if they did, a lot of times they would be rented out to other people for work. And there were various records that can be used for that. So researching from 1850. Was there a special census taken by the state after the Civil War? In one of the handouts, I believe I have that for all the states. That is one of the best resources because, and I'm going to just use the example when I first found my first state census, I was so excited. It was in Alabama in 1866. And that's right after they were emancipated. So you have the exact household, because you figure they were emancipated. By 1870, in theory, they could have moved. 1866, they were there. So I was able to look at these families and see their entire structures. You saw the slave owners, you saw the various families and how they were broken down, of the former slaves. It was very interesting. So take advantage of state census records whenever you can. If your ancestor is listed in an unexpected state, for example, you know the family is from Louisiana, and they're for some reason showing up in like Ohio, there's a chance they were a runaway slave. And tracking runaway slaves is actually very interesting to do. If you knew where they lived, I'm going to tell you right now, there was an ad put out there for them. And you can read the stories. Their stories. It's fantastic. I had a friend who recently just was able to go back 2 more generations in her family because of tracing her runaway slave ads. Her whole family were runaway. Legalizing marriage in the Freedmen's Bureau. So in most southern states, it wasn't actually legal for black people to be married. So even though mainly slaves. So even though you may have lived with someone and had kids, you weren't really married. And then after the Civil War, they started the Freedmen's Bureau, which was not just for African Americans, which most people think they are, it was actually for poor people as well. So the idea was to help out the poor and the downtrodden, give them a leg up. And the Freedmen's Bureau with African Americans did a few things more. So they took marriages and basically legalized them. So if you were cohabitating, is what they called it, with someone, you would go to the Freedmen's Bureau and you would tell them that, register your marriage. And if necessary, they had a minister there to finish it off for you, to make it legitimate. So when you have those records now, you can find out in the Freedmen's Bureau, they're online to some extent. They're online. But there are a lot more records from the Freedmen's Bureau at the National Archives. Unfortunately, they're not indexed either. But there are all kinds of things. There are people who make complaints about things that happen in the South, atrocities, is another thing claimed. There's so many different records that the Freedmen's Bureau had. Medical information. A lot of times on the Freedmen's Bureau records, they listed the slave owner. They listed siblings. They had bank records. There's just so many different things. So the Freedmen's Bureau is a fantastic resource. But I'll be honest with you, it's not the easiest thing to get through. And the commissioners were only for the 11 Confederate states. Let's see if I can remember that one. West Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and DC. So that's all the Freedmen's Bureau covered. So if you were in another state, that you wouldn't have the records of the Freedmen's Bureau. 1890 census. It's just devastating for African Americans not to have the 1890 census. The 1890 census was destroyed. 75% of the 1890 census was destroyed in a fire in the basement of the Congress building in 1921. So you have a lot of general population information that's left. There are 10 states, I believe, they're either fully or partially available. The District of Columbia, they say that it's fully there, but that's not true. And the Oklahoma Territory, that's it. And then for some reason there's this weird register of some of the African Americans that live in Delaware. I have no idea why that even exists. But those are all in the census records. So if you have people in those states that were surviving 25%, I hate to say it, but don't get too excited because they do say they're all there, but not necessarily. But there are other things that can be used instead of the 1890 census. 1890 was actually a good time for city directories. So city directories are wonderful as well because unlike telephone books, which they kind of served as, they gave the name of the person, their spouse, if their female spouse, would be in parentheses. If the woman had died, they would put in parentheses widow of and her husband's name. They would tell you what their job was. They'll give you their address, whether they rented or own a home. So that's, even though you don't have 1890 census, you actually get a lot of information that was on the census out of the city directory. And you would find that in most major cities. Newspaper articles also, 1890 census will help you with the 1890 census. And anyone who was a veteran of the Civil War, they do have some of those records there as well. So, free African Americans before the Civil War. How did your ancestors become free? So, ways. They could have been born free. If they are born free, that means that at least their mother was free, because freedom went through the mother. So at least their mother was free, possibly both parents were. The other way was that their owner freed them. So a lot of people were freed by will. Some people were just emancipated out of will. And other people were, I'm trying to think how it was done. They could have run away to a free state. They were emancipated. And then you also have the indentured people's children. I mentioned that a little down here. It was not uncommon. We always think when you hear about slavery and mixed people, but you always hear about black women with a white father. And a lot of times you actually have a lot of black people who come from a white female indentured servant. They weren't good enough to be with a free white man, so a lot of times they were with black indentured servants or slaves. So in that case, and we'll talk about that actually in 1 second, there were actually even separate rules for white women who gave children, birth to black children. So there was always a lot of rules. And then also, after the Revolutionary War, you saw more black men, slave men, freed than any other time because of the moral good after the Revolutionary War. Everyone felt great. It's much more frequent with anybody being freed. It's usually a woman and children. But black men were freed more during that time than any other, like a decade or two afterwards, which also caused the need for special state, county, and local rules. As a result of the free people, like I said, you can research free African Americans like you could any other American other than Native American. However, there were special records that existed. So you had, for example, cohabitation records. Some states, they wouldn't allow black people to get married even if you were free. So you were cohabited. So there were actually records. And North Carolina, I believe, has fantastic. They have those records still available. We have all the cohabitation. So it lists the parents, the wife and the husband, and how long they've been living together, and possibly who their children were, and maybe even who their parents were. The other thing was the Registry of Free Negroes, which is what I used quite frequently in my research. So how it worked was, after all of these people were being freed, which everyone thought right after the revolution, and let's free everyone, and then they're like, oh my gosh, we have lost these free black people right now. What are we going to do? So things started getting pulled back. So that's when they started making, you have to remember that at the same time all that's happening in Haiti, there's a huge revolt going on, and there's an uprising. So they're looking at what's happening in Haiti, and they've just freed all these people, and like, we've got to make some rules here. So in some states, you were not allowed to come in as a free person. So if you were living in, for example, Maryland, and you were free, you could not move into the state of Virginia. What happened? Because Virginia said no. Of course, the people do it. Yeah, how can they stop you? How can they really stop you? But for that is the law. Another one of the laws was if you were free, you were required to register every 3 years for a fee at the local courthouse. And if you did not register your freedom, then you could be fined, imprisoned, or just picked up as a slave. So it was not cheap to be a free person. You had to be able to pay the fee, and if you had family members, you had to pay that fee for all of your, I think at 16, they started having to register. So those free registered Negroes, it's called Registry of Free Negroes, they were written in the minutes books or the court documents. But there are some counties, some states that actually kept them completely separate. They had a book that was just the Registry of Free Negroes. Those are the best because a lot of those are actually published. You can just go online and take a look, and a lot of them are here in the SDA or library as well. Some of them, very few, are online. But the information you can find out through the Registry of Free Negroes is fantastic, because I have on here, I'm sure you can't see it, but first it gives their name, which is only their given name, and then they'll also leave alias. There's an alias, and they'll give their full name. So for some reason, there's always some aliases of that surname. And it would give a description. They had to have someone that vouched for them. It was usually, I think always, honestly, a white person vouching, saying that, yes, I know this person was born free, or, I know this person, just to say I know this person. It would sometimes give parents' names. It will sometimes give emancipation information. It might say who the name of their slave owner was, when they were emancipated, how they were emancipated, and family members. You would know this because the whole family usually go in together, so you will have a whole family listed together. Even some of the married ones. So that's a great way to also find out when a daughter was married. I went to the library in D.C., Martin Luther King Library one day, and just happened to glance through, and I saw in the emancipation, in the Registry of Free Negroes for D.C., my great-great-grandmother, who her mom had, I guess, purchased her freedom, and they had, she paid the final balance of $5 for her from, and they listed everything. They listed who owned her, in what county, for how long she had been, because even though she hadn't been paid off, she was actually allowed to leave. So they gave all types of information. It was fantastic. It was like just a bathroom break while walking around downtown. I came up with a whole bunch of information. So yes, so there's a lot. So the good thing about the free Negroes is that there are a lot of different ways that they are pointed out. Also, they're in newspapers quite a bit too. That's also fantastic. So apprenticeships. So this happened for not just African Americans, it was poor people, but African Americans, they did have some special rules. I did say if a white woman had a black child, she was punished, she was fined, and if she was poor, and a lot of times they were, otherwise they wouldn't have been, a slave, right? They were probably indentured. Their children would be taken into apprenticeship, and unfortunately for them, it was for 30 years. Normally, if a person was poor or orphaned, or even for a black woman, a free black woman who had children and her husband had died, or she didn't have a husband, the state could require that their children go to apprenticeship. But for all other children, it was to age 21. But for those other children, it was for 30 years, not until they were 30 years old. It was for 30 years. And it wasn't unusual for the parents to put them in either. Because if you're poor and you don't have, you want to make sure your kid has better than you. Like people do now, they would give them an education. The education was, in theory, apprenticeships. So they would send them to someone who would say wonderful things like, we're going to teach them the art and the mystery of farming, which meant that that person pretty much treated them as a slave, as a free farmhand. But at the end of the day, that person did have a trade. So then when they got out of their apprenticeship, they could be the best ones. And there were parents that were looking for even better. They didn't always want farming. A cooper who made barrels, they made good money. A shoemaker was a very specialized field. They made good money. So putting your child in as an apprentice may not be great in the short term, but in the long term, it could have been not a lot good for that child, for the family in general. So apprenticeships weren't all bad. But the 30-year thing really does bother me. Free African Americans really socialized outside the free African American community. And you can understand, they had to look out a lot for each other. They didn't quite fit in with the slaves. They didn't really quite fit in with the white people. They didn't quite fit in with the indentured people, so they were their own community. So when you find a lot of African Americans marrying into each other, yeah, because they were in a certain area, they only had so many free people, and that happened like any rural area as well. So they really socialized, and they did work together as they had tight bonds. They owned businesses, properties, and slaves. Just like anyone else, you can research them through proper records. They had advertisements in newspapers, and you can find it. The slave thing, I found several ancestors that had slaves, and I had always been under the impression that the stories that we've always heard growing up was slaves owned slaves, black people owned slaves because they were buying their family out of freedom. A lot of times I didn't find that the case for the ones that lived in the South. I guess if you were like in Ohio, they moved to a place where there was no slavery, maybe they, bring their families up. But people who stayed in the South, if they had been free for a long time, they were businessmen. And in order to stay competitive, they had to have free labor as well. Although I did find for a lot of the black slave owners, they only seemed to be, it was always young teenage boys. When they got a certain age, they were free. And I could not figure out why, but it was all about taxes. It was more expensive to keep them at a certain age. So the black people get the younger boys, then they would free them. They would emancipate them, but they would keep them young teenage boys. And sometimes they had one or two, not that many. Research against slave ancestors. It is tough. It really is. African Americans, slaves were rarely listed by name in records, by their name. They were, like if we look at the slave schedules, it was a number, and it was, which was their age, their race, which was mulatto or black, and whether they were male or female. Occasionally, you will find for some reason, there are slave schedules that actually have the physical names written out. Those are always treasures. Very few and far between, but it does happen sometimes. The only places you might find their name, and that's might, is in a court record. And of course, if you do find their name, it is just a given name. Wills and things like that. In order to research your enslaved ancestors, you have to know the owner's name. Otherwise, you just can't go any further. So there are a few things you can do. And I talked about newspapers earlier. Strangely enough, especially in the southern and more rural areas, they still reference the slave owners in the newspaper articles, sometimes as early as 1900. So they would say, Sarah Grandison, who was owned by the C family, has now turned 95 years old. So I don't know why they're writing about that in 1900 about who owned her, but that's a piece of information for you. So newspapers are a way possibly to get to the owner's name. The other thing is, when we talk back about the 1870 census and the state censuses to see where they lived in proximity to other people, let's see, maybe they were living by the slave owner. Do they have the same name as that slave owner? If that person has the name, like when they said Malden. Malden isn't a unique name. There's only one other family of Maldens that are in that same town. More than likely, they were owned by the Malden. So once you find the slave owner's name, then you have to start researching. When you're researching for slaves, remember, you're not researching for people, you're researching property. So they're all business transactions. So when you look at wills, there are a lot of times in wills, a guy or a woman would will their children and their spouse, their slaves. Of course, it would be by surname, just given name, but sometimes they did include surnames on there. Gift transfers. So you find these a lot when people are getting married. So say a couple gets married, someone would give them a gift of a slave or two, and it required a document called gift transfer. So that's a document that we actually used. So now you're seeing that, so you're able to see, you're trying to track the life of them. Like I said, you're not tracking, it's strange to say, you're not tracking the life of a person, you're tracking the ownership of property. So that's how you get back to, through your ancestry, is by tracking the property. Child records. Child records are actually very well recorded in the state of Maryland if you have, they're online, they're really well done. Records of transporting slaves across slave state lines, that was the law. So if they moved from one state to the next, there's a record of that, and it's a court record. Research the owner's family and the owner's family papers. So when I talked earlier about one of the things you have to be willing to do is do family trees of other families. When you do have discovered the name of a slave owner, it's important that you do their family tree. And I know that sounds insane and a lot of work. But when you start going through wills and gift transfers and various things, it won't make any sense unless you know how people are related. And it doesn't mean that you have to do a huge family tree for this person, but you might want to do a couple generations from both sides of the family and all their children. So, for example, I have an ancestor who I'll just walk through how I use this process. I have an ancestor who was written up in the newspaper in West Virginia saying that Sarah Grandison was owned by the C family and she's turning this age. So the C family, huge family in that town in West Virginia, and several of them owned slaves. So I didn't know which one, but I knew there was C. And then that's when I reached out to people in the community, other people researching in that area in West Virginia. And I met a guy who's in California, and I was in California at the time just working for a week. And I met with him, and he is a descendant of the C family, and the family property had been sold years ago. But some of the younger family members got together and wanted to take on the things that the people who bought the property were pretty much going to throw away. It was papers, family papers. And they wanted to get those family papers and they wanted to deposit them. Still not put anywhere out, by the way, still at Mark's house. But we started looking through, and it was literally like a journal. Someone was saying that, today slave Sarah had another kid. So not only did they listed slave names, they told about sicknesses, illnesses, they had purchases and sales, and it's a fantastic source of information. So if I hadn't researched the C family tree, I would not have known about the various people. I did not also learn as a result that she was first owned by another family, the Wolf family, or the Wolves, because a transaction was in there, and now I'm tracing the Wolf family tree. So I can see, because it was like he had slaves, didn't have slaves, and all of a sudden he had slaves, but the slaves came about the same time he got married. So more than likely, those slaves came from his wife's family. So it's a bunch of checking wills, gift transfers, family trees. If you have a ancestor who came from a large plantation, which surprisingly enough is not that usual. A lot of times slaves were just a few in a household. But if you have a person that came from a large plantation, more than likely were very rich. And that rich family history came down to the present, and they do have family papers in some repository in a university or a library or something like that. Always go through family papers. If you find a slave owner's family papers, the best thing, a lot of times they're also politicians in the South. And you have fantastic records. And it's not just for African American families that should be using a lot of these records. Actually, everyone should be, because if your family was in there, more than likely your family was mentioned in those records. So if you had a white family member or a black family member, they were all intertwined regardless through the business. And also use state and federal census records for ancestors' locations after emancipation, like we talked about, and study the surrounding families. So the biological origins. So we create these family trees, and I guess you could say this for anyone, but it really isn't, we don't have proof that that's actual parentage. So when you have a slave family, and it's the mom, the dad, and all the kids involved, doesn't really mean that was the father of the kids. We don't know how many times this person was sold, or the father was sold, or the husband was sold, or whether or not they came with some children, one came with one child, one came with some other. But these kids were just kind of their families, just like when we moved here today. If you move from your hometown to another city, you kind of form your own little family in your new town. And in a way, that's actually what happened in the slave community as well. So you may not be looking at actual biological origins, you're looking at a family unit. Like I said, we talked about the indentured white mothers and the slave fathers. I am a huge proponent for African Americans to use genealogy DNA tests to take a look at their family history. And the reason why I did a lot of genealogy DNA research, and it's pretty much like an adoption. Like people who are adopted or do these DNA tests within their families, it's kind of the same thing. And it is interesting to see how we're all connected. And sometimes you get some really good hits. Native American ancestry. So there are a lot, in certain areas, you're going to have African Americans that are related to Native Americans. So it's kind of a tricky thing. Native Americans were huge slave owners. So the Cherokees being the largest group. In the beginning, Native Americans and African Americans were really close, actually, as servants to Europeans. And then in the, late 1800s, the superintendent of, I think it was the South Ohio, but they recommended that the Native Americans use chattel slavery. The Cherokee was the biggest. The Cherokee also, they did follow the rules that when the United States emancipated slaves, the Cherokees did as well, and they were given the option in most situations to become a part of a tribe. However, the Cherokees had a lot of restrictions about mixed marriages. They did not have, and voting rights as well. So although you may have been a citizen, you were not really a full citizen, and there were certain rules, regulations against how you moved about the tribe. For the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw, those are more interesting because they were in fight with the U.S. territories. They were fighting for quite some time with the U.S. government, and the U.S. government told them that they had to end slavery. So the Choctaws said, okay, so they ended slavery, and but they would not admit any of their freed slaves into their tribe. And the United States fought them about it, and it wound up that a lot of African Americans just wound up leaving. But it wasn't until 1885. So in 1866, the Choctaws freed them, but it wasn't until 1885 that they allowed them citizenship. And they were very particular about who they allowed in. The Chickasaw got into a lot more trouble because they wouldn't free the slaves, and they were like most of those Native American tribes. They were all inside the Confederate because they didn't like the United States for taking their territories. The Chickasaw were in a lot more trouble because they refused to do a lot of things, including free their slaves. So as a result, the United States took half their territory with no compensation whatsoever. And that's the same property that was given to them after the removal. So no compensation, they took their land. At the same time, what's happening is there are free African Americans that have no, so you had with the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, you had people that for decades were nothing. They weren't Americans, they weren't Native Americans, they were just there, and they lived in a spot of land on the side. It was when the Chickasaw finally agreed to allow citizenship. They had the rule that you had to have one parent that was Chickasaw, or you had to just put in a request, an application, what they do by most of the applications. Now, you have to know the tribe that your family was part of, because everything is very different. Like in parts of Virginia, there are Native American tribes that let African Americans in ages ago, because they lived alongside them. So and there was no specific rules. But you have to know the tribe. You need to learn about their location, their culture, traditions. When we talk about folklore, I have to chuckle sometimes when people say, well, yeah, my family were Comanches. Where was your family from? What state were they living in? So really know the tribe, know where your families are from, and the cultures of the tribe. That's how you're going to learn more. There were the DAR rolls, or the special census records. When we talk about, remember, Native Americans weren't on the federal census until 1900. They weren't counted. So you could check the DAWS rolls, which was created by the DAWS Commission. It was all about allocation of land and money. It was for the 5 nations, which is the Seminoles, I can't remember, the Seminoles, I think the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokees, I don't know, missing one.
The Creeks.
And the Creeks, thank you. So it was only for the 5 nations. They were in the Cherokee. You will find other Native American tribes, the Delaware Indians, and a couple more because they were adopted in by the Cherokees. So you might find, and you will find free African Americans in there as well. The really interesting thing is that, remember, the DAWS rolls was in order to allocate land. So there were people all around the country who were just sending in applications, just sending them in. Did they have any Native American? We don't know if they actually belong to a tribe, but there are tons of applications. They are available online, and I think, I know Ancestry, but they are available online, and you can see the letters of, I'm sorry, you are not going to be a member of this tribe, and there are quite a few of those. There are quite a few, and it's actually a little funny, but most of the times, how do you know you're related? Well, I was always told my great, and that's always the story on these things, just application after application. But they are really good to read through. The triracial communities, there are several in the United States. So the Lumbeys, Robeson, North Carolina, Robeson County. There's in Kentucky, there's the Legends. There are the brass ankles or the Turks, I believe, right in North Carolina, I think. And there's another one. But there's several well-known triracial communities. And usually the 3 races are African, Portuguese, and Native American. And I have to say that if you ever go on the internet and look up the triracial communities, it is very controversial of what their makeup is. It's extremely controversial, and there are DNA projects now trying to prove it, and there's still a lot of fighting over it. But those are the 3. It's usually Portuguese, not Spanish. They usually use Portuguese. And that is a good point about, I do find a lot of times in those triracial communities, it is the Portuguese, not the Spanish, because, I never understood why, but when you're looking at slavery, you have the East Coast that was run by Portugal. They went around the east side of Africa, and then you have the other Europeans that came around along the west side. But a lot of times the Portuguese, for some reason, a lot of the Native American tribes, whether it was in Brazil or even in the Caribbean, or I don't know, and maybe that's where the tribal communities came from. And of course, in Louisiana, you have two triracial communities. You have the French Native American African, and you still have the Spanish African and Native Americans. You put two. Ethnicity in the census. I hear a lot of people that focus on when it says, oh, there's black and mulatto. It means absolutely none. The only one that you'll see, like there is octoroon and quadroon and all those, the only place you'll see those is usually in Louisiana. No one else went into that detail. But the whole mulatto thing, in theory, is supposed to mean, your mother was, one of your parents is white, one's black, octoroon is a quarter, is an eighth, quadroon is a fourth. But really, when the census trackers took the census, they just looked at it and said, yeah, they're fair skinned, they're mulatto. So it doesn't really mean anything. One of the things that, when you're doing African American genealogy, crossing the color line, the racial barrier, it happened quite a bit. So you do have your fair-skinned African Americans, and a lot of times they would move west. And as they moved west, they became white. Sometimes north, but it was usually west. And you'll find, like in Louisiana, a lot of times it was moved west. Virginia moved west. It's always moving west. And by the time they get to California, they change even more, and they are white. So when you're researching African American ancestors, don't pay attention all the time to the ethnicity in the census. I have, my favorite story is one person I found in my family tree who was a black guy who was born in D.C. And his family is my family. And he wound up moving to Boston. And when he got to Boston, he told them that he was applying for application to go to Canada for 3 months to learn about the country. He came back in 3 months and claimed to be French Canadian, and he became naturalized here in the United States. And he said his father was French Canadian. I don't know what happened. He wanted to marry a black woman, and they had several children. But then he moved and became Mexican when he went west. And his father was still French Canadian, and his mother became Patagonian. So there's a wonderful article after his death about how he traveled the world and spoke all these languages. I'm like, what in the world? He was from D.C. But to trace his story was so fascinating. But we do have a lot of ancestors across the color line, so it is possible that you are tracing families whose records may not even be correct because they may not list who their actual heritage is. So the validity of racial descriptions, I don't take too much for it. This is a picture of my various family members. So my mother's on the upper right. She was either white or Native American. She was black. My son is on the right, actually, that is Irish, in Ireland with his Fitzpatrick clan gathering. But usually when he's here in D.C., they consider him Dominican. I'm Puerto Rican. My father is on the bottom right. When we lived overseas in Egypt, usually all Egyptians thought he was Egyptian. And on the left was my great-grandfather, and my aunt. My two aunts. So you can see how colors can change, people can look different things. So just to say that we look a certain way doesn't really mean anything. It's all just the mixes that we have. I still cannot get my son to buy a kilt. I keep trying. He's like, not with dreads, Mom, not right. So the name game. I think this is really one of the just as bad as tracing slavery. One of the more difficult things is the names for African Americans, how they change. So you'll see different types of changes from slavery to freedom. Excuse me. In colonial times and early national era, colonial Africans kept their names. So you will find African names, at least in the beginning. Of course, they wanted to become more Americanized, so they changed the name. But in the very beginning, colonial Africans retained their ethnic names. And it is important to understand they were colonial Africans because some of them came as indentures, not as slaves. So they didn't have a name change. Other Africans were given European names at that time. And it was very popular, for some reason, to use classical names like Caesar, or place names like Boston, or status names like Prince, or Queenie. I don't understand, but those were the names that were usually given. And then the issue became, once Europeans realized, well, wait a minute, we're changing all these names to European names, and they have the same name as ours, so there's like a John, and then I'm a John, so it became of color. So you will find in some of the colonial records, it's this person of color. Because now they have European names, they have to differentiate. Or sometimes it just says COL for colored. When you get later on, we'll talk about their free Negroes, FN, there are all types of abbreviations. But also you'll find that for free African Americans during this time, like I said, they had surnames, but sometimes it was still the same issue of color. So they might get like Negro John Adams, you know, something like that. Something to differentiate. So you would know who they were talking about. After slavery, after emancipation, and even for some of the free slaves before that, you'll see name changes, not because they were trying to change their name, but because, like we said, those census record takers weren't necessarily the brightest people in the world. And then they asked you what your name was, and you have this drawl or accent, and they're going phonetically by what you said. And I laughed at this, not my family at all, but I was just looking through some records, and there was a free black man in 1860 who changed his name, and they thought that was shady that he had changed his name. And they said, you know, your name was always John Smith. Why is it now John Todd? He said, because everyone kept writing Todd down, so he just changed his name. Not because he wanted to, it's just that for some reason people heard that, and that's what he just said. It was just easier to just everyone call you that. So it was just errors in the way things were done, the way things were spelled. That's why you might have sometimes in families where half the family spells it one way and half is another folklore that you hear in African American families is, oh, the ones that went fair-skinned or white changed their name to this. And you know, a lot of times, like we have that in our family, they're the male family. Some can spell it M-A-L-E, and some spell it M-A-Y-L-E. But the reason why, because they lived in two different counties, and the census records always wrote M-A-L-E for these, and they always wrote M-A-Y-L-E for them. So to this day, they're the same family, but they have two different names. So that would just be the issue. Legal status also is the issue. So when things started changing for African Americans, when we talked about the surnames, and they didn't have surnames, they had just given names. A lot of times they didn't care for using their given name. So I don't know why, but Cuffy was a very popular male slave name. Don't know why, don't even know where that comes from. Cuffy. So when they came to freedom, a lot of them became Jim Cuffy. So they gave themselves a first name, and Cuffy became the last name. And then it's really funny because almost every Cuffy turned in decades later into coffee. So they were Cuffies, and now they're all coffees. So that's just to show you how a name changed. But the legal status changed how we were doing things. And also names changed, and this might be when you're doing slave research, sometimes the names change between transfers of slavery. So when, for example, the Wolf family owned Sarah, she was not known as Sarah, so she was Sarah. But when she came to the C family, they called her Sarah, which was her name, but Sally was just her name. So now she's on records as Sarah and Sally, which is a little difficult and takes a little bit of research of looking at ages and various things, but there are a lot of name changes. There's also the surnames. That is tricky. Surnames there was various things they could do. one of the common for surnames initially was Friedman, or Friedman, because they were so proud of being free. But then after a decade, they're like, yeah, this means absolutely nothing. So a lot of them just changed their name. So someone may have been Friedman in 1870, but by 1880 it was something else. A lot of times given names, like I said, Jim Puffy. In my family, we had the name change where there was no surname even after freedom. My ancestor was freed in 1698 by will. Well, she was an indentured servant, but she never kept a surname. She gave her daughter last name of just so happens a male slave that lived down the road. So I'm just saying her surname was the name of a male slave that Mingo. So she was Jane Mingo. So, which was weird. So we're pretty much sure Mingo was her dad. And then after her daughter had a son, and her daughter named him William Mingo. But after the grandmother died, whose name was Charity, the son, everyone dropped the name Mingo, and they all became Charities. And we're guessing it was to memorialize the one who was freed and the one who did so much for the family. So that is one thing. So last names become first names. Sometimes they change the names of the people who emancipated them. So if you had, there were a lot of abolitionists emancipating people as well. So if they did that, people would just change their name to their last name. Past and current presidents are very popular. That's why you have so many Jacksons nowadays and Johnsons. You have a lot of famous people because that's the names they knew. So they knew. Take the name of the slave owner. You know, there's a lot of that, but not as much as you think. There was a study done in 2006 in Maryland where they did. They looked at all the slaves in PG County, and about 2/3, I think they said, 2/3 to 3/4, something like that, of the people, when they came out, they were emancipated, they did not take the slave owner's name. So it's really not that common. And you have to look at it from the point of view of the slave owner. They really didn't want you to give their name. They didn't want you to take their name. So it's a good thing to use when you initially start. Take a look to see if there's a slave owner with a name. And usually, sometimes look at county over as well. We had recently there's a guy I was helping. He's a Tuskegee Airman, and he said, I can't figure out where my family's from. And I just kind of, he's from Maryland. I had to laugh because it's like there's only 2 people with their family's last name, and it's a white family, slave owners in this county, and there were 3 white people in this county. And as the people died, the white people died in this county, all of a sudden the 3 black people with the same last name came on that side. So it's obvious to see that these 2 people were more than likely the same. And if you even looked at when the free African Americans in this county went up, you can actually check the wills. And you can go through the wills and see he died and he freed these 5, and then these 17 moved on to his son. So you see all of a sudden 5 new free black people in this household. So those are things you take a look at, the last names. And then find clues in naming conventions. There's one thing I have heard, but I've never seen it myself. Maybe I have, and I don't realize what it is. They claim that some slaves had secret names, family names, secret surnames that came down through the generations. I don't know if that's true. Maybe if there's a middle name, maybe. I mean, I found it in a couple that there's a middle name of a European family that's quite often used. Maybe that means you're from that family. I don't know. I've never seen it, but there's a lot of talk of secret surnames. But there are other things like, if there is a last name as a middle name, that's something to pay attention to, because it could mean that there is a connection to a European family, or it could be the surname, or the wife, the mother name. Or other naming conventions, and I found it in Virginia, a little bit in Pennsylvania, and a couple, but mainly it's a southern thing, is how they name their children. And it's, I would love to suddenly do a study to figure out if this is all over the place, but if you look at the census records, like the firstborn son usually was the name of an uncle on his father's side. A lot of times it was an uncle, not necessarily dead, but just an uncle. Then the second-born son would have either the first name or middle name of the grandfather, paternal grandfather. And then the third son or later would be named after the father. The firstborn daughter was almost always named before the mother. The problem here was that you did not know that they were named for their mother or that one of the sons were named for their father because they never called them by that name because they didn't want to have two Henrys in the household. So you have a Henry and a Miles, so you've been tracking this Miles for years, and then all of a sudden he's gone. You're like, oh, Miles must have died, and there's no death record. No, after his dad died, he changed his name back to Henry. And you have the same thing with the daughters. He did Emily and things like that. So sometimes when you're researching, it is a given name change as well. Just because they don't, the juniors, I guess, it's easier. And also because, like I said, during slavery, sometimes they had to figure out what name fit for them. So that is, I just dumped a bunch on you. But are there any questions?
What was the slide that you had? You did this one of the pictures that was on the slide. It was one that says 1850 to 18.
Oh, the pictures? That is a manumission record. That's just the title on the right. That's the title of the manumission record of it. It says Negro Bullock. Alias, I think it's saying alias Magdalena. Beulah. Okay, so that's what it says. Negro Beulah, alias Magdalena. And the next to it is actually a runaway slave act. $25 reward. Left his home last Friday. My man Harry Hawkins, 24 years of age, 5 feet 7 inches high, rather good looking, is of dark chestnut color, large eyes, pleasant when spoken to. He may be learning about Baltimore as he has a wife in the western section of the city. The above reward will be given if brought home or lodged in jail, so I may get him again. So it gives you an example of how much information is, I mean, if you knew that Harry Hawkins was your ancestor, you know you had a wife living in Baltimore, you had a whole bunch of information about it. So they really are good.
Another question I had is tracing prior to 1869. Have answers to that was born in 1832. And she was born on a small farm. And can't figure out who her mother was. But 21-year-old slave female was listed as 1857 by this slave owner family as it was the column that was checked off was one that said fugitive. So she was at the time of the slave said that she was listed. So I researched newspapers that were in print at that time, but I don't know whether these newspapers are microfiche to see if such a thing as this picture that you have was, published looking around. And and by her missing in 1850, if she did come back, was this the mother of my ancestor that was born in 1852?
Okay, so I'm getting straight. So you said she was born so she was a slave, born in 1852, on a small farm. What state?
Missouri.
Missouri?
Northern Missouri, right off the river.
Do you know what county?
It was L.E.W. But there's also
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's yeah. I don't know. Who's that block?
Another piece of this is that the 1860s things that when she was 8 years old, there's an 8-year-old black male listed, but not an 8-year-old black female.
And it's very possible that that's
so
right.
It's possible.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, slave schedules. I mean, the only thing the only thing they cared about was the count of slaves. They didn't really. I mean, honestly, you're just it's just it's just basic information about the ages of and property taxes were involved in the ages of. And I believe even by sex it was a difference too. I think in some states. But that's really a hard one to go through. I mean, there's a lot of records that would have to be gone, because do we know if she ever came back?
Right, that's what I'm saying. I don't know if there was a reward placed in the newspaper, and I don't know if she came back before 1852.
And also,
stuff right there.
and also, you can't always go by exactly even the ages that are on the slave schedules, because sometimes the ages are just off. I mean, and think about this. If you purchased a slave from someone else, they told you that's how old this slave is. We have no idea if that's true or not. Or if it was a fugitive, if she was a fugitive and she was captured and put in someone else could just snap her up, said she's my slave, unless the other guy finds her, there's something they can do. So that's kind of hard. There would have to be a lot more research. And sometimes, I hate to say it, and I guess I should have mentioned it, sometimes you don't get any further. I mean, you just don't. And in some counties, regardless of if you're slave or free or black or white or Native American, with the various, for some reason, every courthouse goes up in flames every once in a while. So things are burnt. I mean, we just don't have records.
Well, it gets even more interesting because my ancestor was born in 1852. She did get married, and there is a marriage record. I found it in this here in the library here. And her last name in this record is Lewis, getting married to her first husband. I traced that to her second husband. But we don't know where she would have that Lewis from. Like, why would she choose that name?
She could have taken it from the county.
Oh.
That's a good point. I mean, you just...
I don't know if your name was Thank
I mean, they took their name from, and I bet you she may have had cousins or whatever, and they spelled it L-E-W-S, and others spell it L-U-S. I mean, no, that's may have been where she got it from. Or it could have been the name of another slave that her name, get to the last name. Yeah.
You mentioned what kind of DNA test helps you to discover what you're made of? Because you mentioned there being some evidence connected to the Egyptians.
Okay. There's a huge study about DNA. I can't go into all of them, but there are a few tests. So there are 3 tests. There's a Y-DNA test that can only be taken by males, and it traces your father's father back several generations. But they have, it's possible to use Y-DNA tests to find cousins and family relationships. It is great for, and I use it quite a bit in researching my families, because that way I can find out who was the patriarch of the family. And also we can figure out, that also helps with who owned them, or necessarily not who owned them, sometimes who was friends with the family that owned them. That seems to be quite often, or worked for that family. Then there's the mitochondrial DNA, which is not helpful for the most part in that situation. It goes back to your mother's mother. And all that's really going to tell you is the origin of your family. So, for example, for me that helped, because I had the folklore. People in West Virginia told me they knew my great-grandmother, and she was Native American, she frightened them, they all thought she was going to put a curse on them. And then I took my mitochondrial DNA test, and it says my origins were either in Eastern Europe or the Near East, which is not Native American at all. So that made me go do some research, and I found online a record. I don't know why, but in the request for a marriage license, they made my great-grandmother, my great-grandmother and great-grandfather write out who they were. So he wrote a whole paragraph saying, my name is James Hinton Clifford, my father is this person, I was born in this state, he has his whole family history right there. She wrote, my name is Elizabeth Stevens, and I have been tracing the Stevens family for about a decade, and was having a hard time. And she said that she was adopted by this couple, the Stevens family, one being her aunt, her paternal aunt, and the other just being her husband. But she was born in Shenandoah, Virginia in 1868. And her parents were Miss, and it was Miss in a, not a derogatory sense, but not a young baby type. So it just means that it was, she's an older, unmarried woman, or she's had a child out of wedlock, which in this case it was. So in Shenandoah, her name was Miss Weimer, and her father was Samuel Grandison. Well, I know Samuel Grandison because that's part of my family, and he was a former slave who sometimes could pass for a white person after emancipation. And when I did a little bit more research, there was only one Weimer family that lived in Shenandoah, Virginia, which just happens to be right over the mountain from where Samuel Grandison lived. And it was a white family. There were 4 white women living there with that last name. One was grandma, one was mom, and there were 2 daughters. And one was 21, and one was 19, and one was 14. The 19-year-old wound up marrying well. The 14-year-old became a servant by 1870, and she wound up marrying her cousin. So I pretty much know who my great-great-grandmother probably was. It was that one. And with DNA tests, the autosomal DNA testing kind of searches your whole side of blast. So it searches your both sides, your mother, your father's side, and supposedly back to 7 generations. And with that, I can verify that yes, not only am I related to other people who've taken the DNA test, that's the thing, I'm actually with other people who took the DNA test. And I can see that there are other Weimers, and I know that the Weimers and the officials married, and that's it. So I know because I did the family tree of the Weimar family. So once again, why you have to do sometimes family trees of different families. So I have family trees for several people I match DNA with to figure out how we connect. And that's why we have the optographs and the officials and the Weimars, and we all found out that we matched because we take the same test. As far as the ethnicity side of it, I would take those with a grain of salt. They give you a breakout of, you are, which I laugh because I'm 101% for some reason on two different companies. I don't know what, I have an extra gene here or something, but on both of them, it's really strange, 101%. But they break out, what you say, you have this percentage of Native American, this percentage of Middle Eastern, this percentage of, and they just tell you what it is. I would take it with a grain of salt. There's no way for them to tell. They're looking at people now. They're taking DNA testing people now and finding out what population is from, who is currently in this section of Africa. Not really helpful because ages ago, those people weren't in that section of Africa. You know what I mean? They migrated over the years. They've mixed. I mean, but it's fun. I mean, it is fun, and you do look. And for example, for me, seeing that I had Egyptian, I have North African, a certain percentage of, and it's a high enough percentage, and that's a good thing. It's a high enough percentage, which actually validates some of what my grandfather says.
Which of the 3 was that one?
That's the autosomal, and that's actually done by several companies. That's Ancestry is the one who does that now. Family Tree DNA does it. 23andMe does it. I can't remember all the companies. Those are the big 3. Family Tree DNA is the only one I think who does an in-depth mitochondrial and Y DNA. They do it in 23andMe, but it's very low levels.
Thank you.
Just like the difficulty yesterday, doing research, I'm looking at my West Virginia, my paternal side on both sides. I've been there for years, my family. And on my grandmother's paternal side, I'm seeing records. Like I started out with mothers, and I got stuck at her grandmother. Her obituary did say she died in like 1928. Said the slave holders.
Isn't that amazing that late? They wouldn't even mention. I still don't understand, but yeah.
So I was like, oh, okay. So I was getting stuck right there, and my plan was to look at all sides. So I started looking at like my father's side, which was her maiden name Thompson, and even as so 1850, they were free blacks, but like all the families are intact and everything is there, and I'm starting to almost like get confused.
Oh, it's so easy to get confused with any of them.
Because it's like, wait a minute, there's a whole lot. So the reason why I'm bringing it up is like when you can go that far back, and then like uncle, I think I saw or grandfather being in a house that said Dixon, and I thought maybe this was like a white house that he, because he was listed as laborer. But then when I started looking at the head of the household, and I found the marriage record, it was his sister. Emily Dixon was real Emily Thompson. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is that as I keep going further back, and I know that Thompsons have come over from England like early 1600s, 1500s, what, like, I'm trying to get some clues and stuff.
It is hard. You know, we laugh because we have this one family that we have. Fred, actually, she's not even in the family. It's one family. We just have a very large house and a room that she's not using, and we have this huge wall just trying to figure out because they also call each of their kids the same names, which just drove me insane. So they're like in the same town. They have kids around the same time. They name them all the same thing. Come on, people. No birth records to prove any of this. So you said Virginia?
Yeah.
What part of Virginia?
Westmoreland County.
Oh, Westmoreland. Okay, so if the Thompsons were that far back, then that's one of the resources on there. One of the best resources for free African American families is Paul, I can never pronounce his last name, Hennig, I don't know. Free African Americans. It's online for free of charge. He updates it on a regular basis, but there's also books. I know we have some books here in DAR. So what Paul has done is when he's come across records in, I think, Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, I think South Carolina, and definitely in Virginia, when he comes across any records on free African Americans, mainly in colonial times, he builds kind of family trees. So although Paul's stuff is fantastic, use it as a clue or a hint, like I said, because he is taking for granted. A lot of times you'll see he notes that these people could have been the descendants of, because he doesn't have the proof to make that connection. But the great thing about him is not only does he create these family trees, he also gives you the resource. He lists the resource where he actually found that record. So if you look on, like I said, freeafricanamericans.com, and there's a breakout. He has by state, and there's also, I think he also lists Revolutionary War soldiers in those states. Some property tax lists are in there, which are great. Property taxes, fantastic. If you can find them, they're free. They say FN next to their name, so you know they're free Negroes. I'm trying to think what else. But he has a really fantastic source of information, especially colonial African American. But like I said, you do have to kind of go through the records, and if you go through,
I've been down there and I've seen land needs and
So you went to University of the Library of Virginia?
No, the Montrose County.
Montrose County records.
The court record. The thing that I'm curious about is that it seems like I'm finding records, but putting the pieces together,
Right.
and also like maybe starting to look to put visual representation of what those things look like, because pulling back from they left there, like during the Depression and all these things, my grandmother's mother died of meningitis when all the kids were little, and after that, nobody talks about it.
Well, no.
I forgot, I don't know everything, and all this stuff minus their mother dying was intact to the 1600s. So.
It is with any, whether or not it's, especially actually when you go through slave genealogy, because that's just a whole new thing. It is very important to be able to just take all those pieces. All those pieces you find, just write them down or you put them somewhere. And then eventually, sometime you go back and look, oh, there was a James listed in there. Let me see if that James. Because eventually, those will fit. Maybe not soon, but at some point, they will fit into your genealogy. But looking at the Registry of Free Negroes will be very helpful for that as well. Because that would get parentages. Oh, sure. Which ones? Oh, on this? So this is a newspaper article. Washington Post, I believe, just deaths reported. So this is if you were trying to trace anyone, regardless of the time, they have death records before. Now, there were some where they were not obituaries. These were just death reports. So then, like the Washington Post would just get a report saying, here, all the people died. So you can find out from there. Now, it doesn't give you a lot of information, of course, because they're not obituaries. But think about, for a person who couldn't afford an obituary, if it was a death record, it's at least a little helpful. You just have a little bit of information. This one, I'm trying to figure, that was the record I actually talked about from my great-grandmother and great-grandfather had to write their paragraphs about who they were. And that's how I found out who her real parent, what her real parentage was. That's actually that record. And it's online. It's on my West Virginia website. The record next to that one is my other great-grandfather's, when he joined up for the Navy, this was his honorable discharge, his second honorable discharge that he had. This is a runaway slave ad. This is a runaway slave ad. This one, we talked about names. You saw the one before, it said, it gave his first name and his last name. This one says Negro wench. So, I mean, what's that going to get you, But this one, and I will read it out because I know you can't see it. It's a $2,000 reward, ran away. This is in 1781, so this is one of our older ones. On Sunday last, from the forest driver in Needham Township, Morris County, a Negro man named Joe, about 30 years of age, 5 foot 8 inches high, one leg a little shorter than the other, part of his great toe cut off, lost from the 14th, and his back is much fortified in lumps by whipping. Also, a handsome Negro wench, 18 years old. So they named Joe. But the girl is just a Negro wench. She's 18. With her child of 6 weeks old, which found in clothes, something of his clothes being found, that she is supposed to have killed. She's she's wearing clothes of a person that supposedly she killed. That's what the Negroes went off with one slight, a soldiers belonging to 2nd Pennsylvania Regiment. And they stole and took with them a variety of clothes and 2 horses and one a bay, 4 years old, the other a gray, 7 years old, and had switch tails. So they're giving all this information. But they list witnesses but yeah, and that's a $2,000 reward. So in 1781. So yeah, but they stole a lot of things. They took horses and clothes, and so there was a lot. This one is it's just a census record, and in the middle, this is something I didn't quite talk about. So when a lot of the slaves were freed, not slaves, I take that back. When a lot of people were becoming emancipated before emancipation, they were being freed with the manumission records. There became a shift not to say, it's great that you guys are free, so we should just go back to Africa. We should send you back to Africa. And there were free people who believed that as well. But it mainly was a push to move all the free. Like I said, Haiti was freaking a lot of people out because the uprising in Haiti was pretty bad. So there were, in this case, this was some of the things that were found in. It was a whole section about the move to Liberia, and the freedmen who wanted to stay and thought it was unfair to have to go, and then the people who wanted to go. And there were two different factions within the African American community. So you had people that were advertising, various things. We can get you, these things, ex-slaves. We can help you in this way, or things like that. So it was the Liberia thing was interesting. How many people did go, and it is well documented. It's very well documented. The people who went. I had done research for a lady who was actually joining DAR, who her family wound up in Liberia. She just thought they all died. And I was like, your name, they had like a president in Liberia with that name. She's like, no, my family's from North Carolina. I'm like, yeah. And it wound up, it was her family. Part of her family went to Liberia, and he became president of Liberia. It was just so weird. But she had no idea.
So how is that, because that part was is like, where do you look to see that documentation from,
It was all over. There was a push. There were a lot of people pushing it. But I did find that a lot of them went out of North Carolina. A lot of people did come out of North Carolina, and I can't remember the name. It was like actually a couple of counties. But there were people from Virginia. That is true. And there is you can actually just Google it, because they even have the list of the people on the ship. And they actually have, there's some they have in Liberia. It seems like in Liberia they were keeping track of all the people coming in. That whole story is fascinating, because there's a lot of things I didn't know about. Liberia could be a whole discussion within itself. But yeah, you can really Google it. And a lot of times you can never Google your family members. Google them. And if you're using Google, if you go over and it says Google more, there's more. If you go to Google Books, your family could be mentioned in a biography somewhere, or in a whole book that's out. I found, which my family hasn't saying about me, I found something in a book about cocktails. And it says, and one of the people in my family tree was the inventor of fruit on the side of a cocktail. I think that is fantastic. My family is so annoyed that I didn't bring this up. But it is, and even though that has really no bearing on my family tree, it does tell me a story of, and actually that did take me why in the world did he invent that? And then I found out his story, and as a result, now I go look, and he was the manager of the bar at the Capitol. But it was all a progression. So little teeny things, sometimes those little teeny things that you think aren't big deal, that's why I say document, folklore, any little story that you find in a newspaper or a book, document it, because that could lead you to the next thing about it.
I just want to say thank you. I have to step out.
Oh, no problem. And we're done. Thank you.